Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the NEP Wednesday webinar. Thanks for joining us again live, and those of you who are watching us on our recording. And just a quick note on the recording, since around about this time last year, we've had about 10,000 views of our recordings. We average about 50 to 70, sometimes over 100 live, but the amount of people who are watching the recordings is really fantastic. Today we're going to be talking about the various Teams functionality for different meetings. And if you think about your daily week, your work week, you can have all sorts of meetings with all sorts of partners, members of the public, people internally. And do we always use the best functionality that we've got in the platform? So we're going to discuss that today with Nick from Microsoft, who's joined us again to help us, to guide us through the different approaches. And we're going to be starting off with the familiar space that you're all used to, but then going into perhaps the live events. And it will get a little confusing because we are calling this a Wednesday webinar, but we're hosting it as a live event. And there's now a webinar function. And we'll explain why we do it the way we do at the moment in a second. So questions please into the chat. If you've got a scenario and want to know what sort of meeting and which functions you will want to use for that meeting to get the best out of it, pop your question into the chat. Nick and I will answer that as we go through the session today. That's going to be really important. And again, if you've got any other webinar content that you want us to feature, get in touch with us, ask us any questions, and help us shape the way these contents are done each week for you. So let's have a start with Nick and see what we're going to do today. Let's start off with the familiar Teams meetings that we're all used to doing on a daily basis, but many of us don't normally use much of the functionality that's sitting hidden away in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. So let me just share my screen a second. Okay, so we're going to go through, as David mentioned, then the different types of meetings that you can actually hold in Microsoft Teams. So if you're familiar with Teams today, you will more than likely create a Teams meeting either within your Outlook diary, just by clicking on that little Teams icon, or perhaps you may go into Microsoft Teams and click on your calendar icon here, and you would probably just click on a timescale you want to create a meeting. Invite some attendees, put some details in it and so forth, as you're probably quite familiar. Within the Teams, if I just actually create one here, I'm just going to create test. I've got no imagination today. And I'm just going to invite Nesta, as I always do. And it is as simple as sort of sending that message out. And if you are familiar with Teams meetings, what you'll notice is when you go back into that meeting, once you've sent it, you have a lot more options. If you wanted to, you can start putting your whiteboard together. You can have it active within that meeting. You can start creating some notes. Perhaps you want to put an agenda into the meeting as a sort of pre-meeting agenda. You can get your audience to start putting information into that AOB or what that looks like. You can also, if you wanted to, click on that little tab button here. This applies to all Teams meetings, and perhaps you might want to put some polls, some forms within that meeting, and you can do that within any of these Teams meetings. And what you can do with polls is actually you can start creating polls before your meeting starts. It doesn't sort of stop that the motion of that meeting. So if you want to create a poll beforehand, you can kick it off during that meeting. So that's hopefully what you've seen already today as you working within Teams. There are some limitations. I'll say limitations. A lot of it is around the participants of a Teams meeting. There is a maximum of 1,000 currently for interactivity within that Teams meeting. So that means that someone can have their video on, they can use the reactions within that Teams meeting, put their hand up, they can give you a couple of emojis, they can see the chats, they can see the polls. That's a maximum of 1,000. We do have a little bit further on from that participation number, and that's currently 20,000. So when you go over that 2,001th person, what you'll find is that 1,001th person actually has view only capability. So they won't be able to have their video on or actually come off of mute. They won't be able to use those live reactions. So they'll have a live view only of that participating in that meeting. Now at 20,000, there is a slight caveat, there is a slight change coming in December. So what we've done is we've committed to our customers that limit of 20,000 is in place until December 2021. Things change all the time, as you know, so the best place to look is that Microsoft roadmap site, and you can have a look at our limits on there. We also have within Teams webinar. Now this is quite fairly new, and if you've seen it, it's really great. It does have slightly different functionality. You still find it in Teams, and what you do, rather than actually click on new meeting, or as I said there, click on a time and date within your diary, you just use a drop down button here and you can click on webinar. Now, what webinar, the additional functionality of webinar is it allows you to have an attendee registration form. So if you are, for example, organising maybe some training sessions or maybe a conference or something, and actually what you want to do is send out an invitation to your users, what you can do is click on the webinar link, set up your webinar. You can add your presenter. So at this stage, only your presenter would actually get the notification of this particular webinar meeting that's taken place. So as always, I'll invite Nesta as my presenter. Okay, and I'm just going to make sure 20 seconds. Yeah, just make sure that's after the time that we're actually here today. So 3:30, for example. Okay, and it is as simple as just sending it out. And what you can do when you go back into that meeting, if I can find the right one, that one there. If I double click on it, I have a few more options. Again, I can set up my whiteboard. I can set up an agenda within my notes. So very similar to what you've seen within that Teams meeting. But also what I can do is customize a registration form. Okay, if you click on that, it just takes you to another little page and it comes up with some information around what you want to collect from your users. So you can edit this registration page, and you could, if you wanted to, upload an image. Now I have a very poor image of the NEP logo. Apologies, I did this quite late last night and it's not as great as what David would create. The image is awful, but there you go. You can create a nice little image. There's a bit of a way to your users that are going to register for this event. You can give it a title. So we said this one's called webinar. I'm just going to check the date. I think I put it down as 1 o'clock. There's a little bit of a gotcha there, isn't there, David, that you do need to repeat in this registration area here. You do need to repeat the time of your event.
Yeah, I got it wrong first time I used it. So double check, and then check it again. Always the rules. You'd hope it would replicate across, but it doesn't.
What you can do there, David, is sometimes it's a bit like our meeting or our live events that we have on a Wednesday. We always pop into the meeting 15 minutes beforehand, don't we, to make sure we're all set up and ready to go and everything's technically ready. Yeah. So the meeting within your Teams, when you create a webinar, you create it for the time that presenter or those presenters need to actually come onto that meeting. This one here could be a slightly different timescale. This one here is when you want your audience to attend. But absolutely right, it's a little bit of a gotcha. Just make sure that your time is correct here for your for the invites to go out. You can create here or a description of what your webinar is about, and when you can add also your guest speaker. So remember, I added Nesta, didn't I, as my guest speaker? I can add Nesta's details here and maybe a little bit of biography of Nesta's position and why he you'd be interested to attend the webinar for him. Now, by default, you have got these at the area here about your first name, surname, and email. Okay, you can add other fields. Say, for example, you may want to collect a little bit of information about maybe where people are actually, or how people are actually attending. So say, how are, something like that. Maybe my options would say from home, add an option, the office, something like this, and I'm going to have it as a required field. I've seen it before, or I've used it before here, maybe for accessibility. I may want to see actually if anybody's got an accessibility requirements actually for my webinar, and that's really essential as well. So you could ask the question there. And then what I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy this registration link. I'm just going to save it.
Mm-hmm. I think just one thing, there are some pre-populated optional fields as well, like job title and organisation spelt with a Z, which again saves time if you want to use those as well. Yeah,
absolutely. So that's in a way, my attendance registration form created. It's as simple as that. Now going back to my Teams meeting here, so I've sent this already to Nesta, who's actually participating as a presenter. But what I want to do now is actually send out that registration form. So within that registration form, I just clicked on the link here, copy registration form, and you can then pop that into a Yammer post. Maybe you have an intranet, maybe you want to send it via email, send it in a number of ways. It's just a URL. Now on my other screen, as always, I've got Nesta waiting in the shadows here, and I'm just I'll bring him over actually so you can see him. I've just copied that URL in, and this is what your user's experience will be. Okay, so you can see my very poor image of the NEP. Apologies. You can see the time slot. You can see who the guest speaker is, and it would put the bio there as well. You can see here it's actually pre-populated my details, my name, surname, and email, and that's because I'm actually on the same tenant. Okay, so I'm on the same organizational M365 environment, so it's already pre-populated Nesta's details. And it has the question, the additional question I've got here. So I actually say I'm going to be working from home, and I can register now. And the nice thing about this, and again, from a user experience point of view, is if I just very quickly go into Outlook, apologies, I thought I had this running, Outlook there. Because Nesta is registered for the event, Nesta would actually receive an email. There you go. So you say you've registered for the event. And the nice thing about this is I can click on the little drop down arrow and click to Nesta's diary. Now, if he doesn't do that, he won't get anything in his diary to remind him of the event. So that's a really top tip there. When you do get registered, just use that drop down arrow within the meeting, add to calendar, and then you get a proper notification. And within that Outlook message or Teams, if you're using Teams calendar, you can just click on the join event. So a couple of things around webinar when we talk about limits and so forth. So we said about Teams, participation, 1,000 users, full interactive, the emojis, the chat, recordings, video and everything, 20,000, up to 20,000 will have the view only capability. When we talk about webinars, we talk about 1,000 have full capability. At the moment, that's a hard limit. If you look at the Microsoft roadmap, we're changing limits all the time, I'm sure there's something coming in the future to increase that limit, but there's nothing sort of nothing on the nothing that's been publicly announced at the moment. The other thing you can do around these webinars, very quickly, if I just go back here, you can actually go into your meeting options. If I go back into meeting options, where's my options? They're meeting options. Oh, sorry, meeting options. This is a page that you're very familiar with if you use Teams meetings. And this is where you can set up your lobby and you can have people announcing who can present. And with a webinar, you can actually choose your presenters. Remember when I first created it, I chose Nesta as a presenter. I can choose here. Can't find any more because Nesta's there anyway. This is where you'd actually choose the options around that webinar functionality. Maybe I might want to remove the mic from people. I might actually want to disable it. So you just have a few options here about controlling your webinar. And when you choose between whether it's a Teams meeting or a webinar, when you think about why you want to have which one, it's all about actually the purpose of your event and how you want to interact with your users.
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. And by default, you've got that sort of functionality in your normal Teams meeting where you can promote people to be a presenter and have everybody else as an attendee and leave their mics off. But the beauty of the webinar function, if you put them down as a presenter, they automatically get the right presenter rights from the start, and you've got that more control. Particularly if you're having a large meeting, you don't want lots of people interrupting with questions or doing screen shares. This is where this comes in really valuable. There is a question in the chat which I'll happily cover because this is about the NEP blueprint in some ways. Will webinars be default to everyone, or is it an admin setting defined like the previous Team Live events? We've actually grouped this in the recommendations from the NEP to be similar to live events because we don't want everybody in the organisation creating web pages that people can register for. So by default, it should be communications teams, and then whichever team requires it. So a local policing commander might want to use it for local community meetings, etc. So it's one of those ones that can be switched on by a team or individual to have that available to them. So that answers that question.
Excellent. There's also a few other things to know about webinars, about post-event. So we've talked about how to create it. We've talked about user experience of actually getting onto the event. I won't actually start the webinar because actually that's very similar to a Teams meeting and the functionality you have. But what I will show you is an example of one that I've already ran. So this particular webinar I set up yesterday, and I got some of the demo people, some of the demo users actually connected to it. So after the event, if within the event I was using a whiteboard, I could still access the whiteboard after the event. But something's actually quite new, and it's the attendance. And this is where, when we talked about, is it a Teams meeting, is it a webinar, and we'll move into live events in a second. Actually, if you want to know who's actually registered for your event, who's actually attended and how long they attended for, then actually maybe your answer is actually to have a webinar rather than actually a Teams, standard Teams meeting.
Yeah.
And with this information, sorry.
Yeah, we're actually holding one tomorrow where we're doing the Power Automator webinar session, and what I was able to do even today, I'm looking at the people who've registered and cancelled in the registration, but then afterwards this is where we'll be able to follow up anything we need to with the people who did attend.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Excellent. Are we ready to move to live events, David? Any other questions?
There's a question in there. So can you add documents, agenda, etc. at any point after the initial Teams meeting invite has been sent out? And does this send an update to people automatically?
That's a very good question. It depends. If we're talking about the invitation has gone out and you then still want to add an attachment, absolutely, because it's a Teams meeting at the end of the day. So even, for example, this one here, this is a webinar. Think of a webinar as a Teams meeting, but it has the added functionality of that registration form and that attendance information. Everything else is sort of the same, to be honest with you, except you can't go over 1,000 users. Okay, after 1,000 users, then it does need to be a live event or a Teams meeting. So what you can do in here is potentially you could go to the chat. You could actually attach something here if you wanted to.
Yeah, so potential uses for this things are like neighborhood meetings where you want people, training sessions where you've got a pool of people who you're sending the link to and you want to know who's attending and keep it registered that way. But certainly better for this one for cross partner events. So if it's a meeting between several people in different forces or partners and stakeholders that you want to invite them along to who don't by default have access to your tenant, etc., the webinar function could be a really powerful way of doing that. Rather than just a normal Teams meeting or a large format Teams meeting where you have those attendants. So really powerful. There is a reason why you wouldn't use this though as well, is you do have to have a Microsoft account to join a webinar meeting, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason why that information is collated for that attendance information. So we need a 365 account to be able to provide that information to the host of this meeting.
So that's the reason, and we'll go on to live events in a second, why we use live events still now. You know, we've got quite a lot of people on watching this meeting live now. There will be a handful who don't haven't been migrated in policing across, or they're from outside of policing, and we don't want to prevent you from accessing these sessions, these video webinars. So that's why we're using live events. So what's the big differences with live events, Nick?
Well, absolutely. So live events are quite different. So this is a live event I've actually created here, and there are a number of ways of creating live event. I'm just going to show you the way in Teams. So what you'll find in Teams is that you can actually create a live event up in the top right hand corner again. And when you actually create a live event, it's just a little bit special. As you know from I'm not going to call it a webinar, the Wednesday webinar, David, because that could be confusing.
Yeah.
As you know from David's sessions on a Wednesday, they are live events. You can't, from an audience partition point of view, you can't actually participate too much. You can't get yourself onto video. You can only do Q&A. Okay, and those Q&As can be vetted. There may be reasons, and when we talk about, is it a Teams meeting, is it a webinar, is it a live event, and it is again all down to the purpose of that event and how much engagement you want from your attendees. So for the sessions we have here for today for live events, we can't see you, you can see us. They're also produced in a slightly different way. So David, as the owner of this meeting, he has more rights than myself, who is a presenter. So there's different roles that you have that you get assigned within live events to be able to control the output a little bit more going forward. And as I said, you can't take yourself off mute, you can't put your hands up, and you can't participate, but you may have reasons why you might want to do that. Maybe it's a chief event or something, and maybe it's a communication going out. You don't want somebody coming off of mute and disturbing that flow. So the way that you create live events, so as I said, you can go into Teams, and you can use a little drop down arrow into new meeting. You can give it a nice little title, so live event. I'm going to give it live event 2 because I often get confused when I do my demos if I call it the same name. You can give yourself a nice little, when do you want this meeting or the live event to run? It's very similar to what you do within Teams meetings and webinars. Give your live event some information, and this is where here you can actually create you can actually invite other people to produce the event with you. So in this case, where we the live event we're running today, as I said, myself, Mike and David are on this call, and you literally, when you create it, you just start calling out the people that you actually want to have that special access, that back-end access to be able to produce this event for you. And you've got different access here. You see Megan, I'm logged in as today. She's the producer, she's created it. And then Nesta, who I've actually invited in, I can then change him to producer or to a presenter role. I'll leave him as presenter for now. And then when you scroll down, there you go, click on next. Now you've got some options here to be specific. I presume for yourself, you do organisation, you do public probably, don't you, David? You do a public event.
These events are made public. But again, you've got this same options on the webinars as well. You can do a webinar only for your organisation access. So if somebody's got the link, they wouldn't get access to it. And similarly, private. All those three options are the same across the board.
Absolutely brilliant. If you just scroll down, sometimes I remember when I sort of first looked at live events, I didn't realize there was a little scroll button. So just remember the little scroll down here. You've got some options here about how to produce it and so forth. But as we talked the other day, David, you don't need you don't need a huge production unit behind you here. David did the last webinar from where was it, David? You were using your 4G on your mobile phone.
Yeah, I was at the Birmingham National Exhibition Centre at the Emergency Services Show on a tiny little bistro table with a 4G and still managed to do it.
Absolutely brilliant. I'm just going to schedule that event. There you go. And what I can do is a bit like webinar when we talked about that attendance. Remember the attendance form that I created? It's similar, but you don't actually have much ability to change. You can just get the link that I can send out, and I can send that copied link via Outlook, via Yammer, however I want to communicate it out. This link here is a special one. When I join, because Megan is the producer, Nesta's the presenter, we just go into the event slightly differently. There's a bit behind the scenes. And then again, if you scroll down here, it gets a little bit more information. This is the bit that gets sent out to the users to join the event, as you know, to be able to see the Q&A and to see the presentation there. Excellent. Okay. Is there any questions coming through, David?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions. So the first one is something we'll probably circulate as part of the attachment, but is there a handy matrix that compares the available features of meetings, live events and webinars?
Are we talking maybe, David, something like this, which I'll share with you after the meeting?
Not that we prepare these meetings.
Not that we prepared. No. Yeah, we'll share it after this event, because as David said, it can get quite confusing about, especially around the limits and about why you would decide each one. So yeah, I will finish this off. I think it's finished anyway. We can share this after the event so we can help you on that journey of understanding, you know, which meeting is best pitched for your particular
yeah, and sometimes you know it's about who's attending, and if you think about who else you want to have access to the information as well. So if you're doing a safeguarding meeting with partners, you're not going to be really using the webinars because you know who you want to be involved. You'll be using the normal Teams live events, but you know you'll have some choices about what you're trying to achieve when it comes to things like Chiefs Roadshows. A live event is in some ways is an easier one to do because you've got control, but a webinar gives you more audit capability. But for either one of them, you can get an attendance list if you limit it just to the organisation. So there's lots of ways about what you want to do and how you want to produce it. We're a bit of a fan of the live event because it gives us a bit more control, and so I can choose to put myself on screen, etc. And then I can put Nick onto screen at any time, and we have a little bit more control. And you can, of course, plug in black boxes and do full video production as well, and have some more control, even live transcripts in Welsh. For our Welsh forces, so there's a lot of functions that you can use. Another question we've got is, can the meeting admin read edited responses from Teams meetings in a channel meeting from a team, not the person? I'm trying to make sense of this. We haven't deliberately not covered channel meetings today, but I think we just need to explain what a channel meeting is versus another.
Yeah. Absolutely. So we haven't, but there is a slightly different meeting type. So you can create meetings in channels. When you create a meeting, a channel, you can't create a webinar. or a live event. So I've just dropped into the NPCC one here, into my general channel. If I wanted to create a meeting, again, it's in my top right hand corner here. And all I can do now, not all I can do because it's got lots of functionality, but within a channel meeting, I either meet now, that calls everybody within that channel, within that team, sorry, onto a meeting, or I can schedule a meeting. So you can't have a webinar or a live event within a channel. The channel meetings, they're slightly different. And the reason why is once you start creating, let me just do one here, a channel meeting, you don't necessarily have to invite anybody. Anybody who's part of that team has access to that meeting, okay, to join it. It could be good practice to actually call out some people in your team that actually are have to join. So maybe I want Alex as well on there. Maybe these two people, I really want them to join the meeting, but anybody else in the team, it's up to you whether you join, and I just send that out. So it appears within the chat message of my channel, and it doesn't stop anybody who has access to my team to be able to gain access to that meeting and see the contents of the meeting. Once it's actually in play and once it's actually completed, they can go back into this meeting and they can see then the meeting's not in play. So they see the options there. If there's any whiteboard, let's have a look if I got one here. If there's any whiteboard, bad example, Saunders. Yeah, you can see the content. It's all about being inclusive when we talk about teams.
But if somebody isn't part of that channel, they wouldn't have access to the files within that channel, would they?
No, that's right.
Be co-opted into the meeting for that one session.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a really good point, David. So if, for example, Nesta wasn't part of this team, I could get him into this channel meeting by calling him out and bringing him into this team channel meeting. It doesn't necessarily mean he needs to be part of that Microsoft team and have access to all that data. So Nesta could join the meeting, but actually after the event, Nesta wouldn't be able to actually come into files and maybe to see any of the SharePoint information or the chat. The consistent chat above that meeting.
Okay, now the reason I've just popped on the live captions is there is a question. So when live events are recorded, are there live captions applied automatically? You can turn them on, and yes, you get a transcript automatically of a live meeting or any other webinar if you turn that on. But live events automatically, when you set the event up, you can set it up to have that transcript and the recording, and you can move that forward. So that's an easy answer to that one. So you can see I've turned on the live captions just for now and in the middle of the meeting. Is there a registration option for live events? No, there isn't, is the answer. That's where the webinar functionality comes in. So you can use that as much as you want to. I thought you could only have one producer for a live event, but you can have as many presenters as you want. Sandra, my advice is always have 2 producers as a minimum, because if my broadband went down or something went wrong, Mike could take over the control of the screens, etc. So yes, and last January, February, we actually ran the Police Digital Summit on live events, and over the 3 days we had 78 different presenters, 3 of us doing the production of it. So you can mix and match that. So you've got all the capability you want to do on that. And there is a webinar on producing a live event that we have done in the recordings, because driving the screen can be a little bit fun in the background. There's another question here around number of live events per tenant running at one time. Phil's saying, is there a limit of 15 live events? Is there a similar limit with webinars?
I have to double check that. Let's take that away and pop it into the event details. I'm not 100% sure, but a lot of the limits change quite frequently. So I haven't looked for a little while. So let's take that one away, David.
I would imagine that the webinars, they're a Teams meeting with an added bit of functionality to get people in the meeting. So it's probably the same rules will apply to that one as normal do. And just getting back to Phil's earlier question about if somebody's delegated a webinar, what will happen if they want somebody else to attend? Will you know who's been delegated, or just get the extra person who's attending instead?
Oh, okay. Just trying to sort of dissect that one slightly.
As far as I can work it out is because you're sending the link out for people to register. Yeah. All you get is the detail of those who are registered.
That's right.
So you don't get the trail of it's been delegated to.
That's correct.
That's the way that one works. We've got another question on channel meetings, and we didn't expect to talk about them. So the screen's just moved across. So let me just pop you back on there. So when you create a channel meeting, how do you stop it from showing it to everyone in everyone's Outlook calendar?
Okay, so it doesn't actually appear. A channel meeting doesn't appear in anybody's Outlook diary unless you actually call them out here. Now, say, for example, let me just take Nesta out of there, actually, because I've got Nesta on my screen, haven't I, on my other screen. So what Nesta can do, if he's part of this team, which he is, and he's part of the general tab, and hopefully my demo tenant will catch up with me. Remember Megan popped in this meeting just now. Nesta's not a member of this or hasn't been called out as an attendee. So what Nesta could do is he could go into this and say, actually, I really want to attend this meeting, and he can add it to his Outlook calendar. So that's a really good top tip. So if somebody puts a channel meeting in the diary, if they've not called you out, it won't appear in your Outlook diary, but you can still see that diary event within that channel. So you know the meeting is going to take place. And if it's something that you want to attend, then just double click on the meeting and you can add to calendar, and that would add to your Outlook diary. So let me just do that. There you go. It says I'm accepted.
Fantastic. So it doesn't by default do that anyway.
It doesn't, but no. When we talk about working in a team, if I was working in the MPCC here, I might not actually be interested in all of it, but from an inclusivity point of view, it's good for me to know I can self-serve. So if there was a meeting going on in the general channel, it doesn't necessarily mean I have to attend, but that organizer may want to call me out by actually adding me into the attendees here. You can see here, Nesta's actually, because he's done the add calendar and is in his diary, he's put himself as an optional there. So if I wanted to call somebody out, anybody in my team or outside of my team or a guest, that's where I'd add them in the attendees list here. Everybody else doesn't get added unless they want to add it to their calendar individually.
Nick, that half hour flew, and we could easily have done half an hour on each of those different elements and then some, but we don't have the time, and we do know that people like to get these shortened sessions from us so they can take away and digest. So there's a lot more to it. On there is the team who are there to help you from the NEP. So on the screen now is all the engagement team. So you look up your force and there's the email address of somebody if you want any help from the NEP at any point in moving through this and get any more information. Also, we've got our next couple of webinars lined up, and they're on the transformation website at any time. You can go and join them. So next week we've got a really powerful one example where Wiltshire are going to be talking us how they've been doing safeguarding in schools and training with schools during the COVID pandemic, but how that's going to affect their new normal and how they've changed their business practice for better because of what they learned through the COVID crisis, and the fantastic work that they've been doing. And then the week after that, we've got the Met Police joining us to talk about how they're helping forces manage the development of Power Apps across the Met, so that they're able to get the most value out of them as we get more and more into Power Apps as we go forward. Do remember, we do want your feedback for these webinars, or if you've got an idea of what you'd like to see or present even, just click on the code. The link's been popped into the chat before. We would like you to give us some feedback so we know what you want, so we can continue planning them and moving them on. So that's it for today. We've run out of time. We hope to see you very, very soon. And thanks for joining us. And please remember, pass these on, share the links on. We'll get the recording live as quickly as we can. Thanks, everyone.